right. Welcome everyone to our first Socialist Town Hall meeting with presidential candidate Joseph Kishore of the Socialist Equality Party. I'm Sam with the International Youth and Students for Social Equality here at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'd like to give a special welcome to our international audience who is watching this event through our online live stream. For tonight's town hall, we will have two speakers give opening remarks. The first is David North, who will be speaking before our presidential candidate, Joseph Kishore. After the opening remarks from both speakers, we will transition to a question and answer session. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, David North, the chairperson of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website and the Socialist Equality Party in the United States. David North has played a leading role in the international socialist movement for 45 years. His many published works include The Heritage We Defend, The Crisis of American Democracy, In Defense of Leon Trotsky, The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century, The Frankfurt School, Postmodernism and the Politics of the Pseudo-Left, and A Quarter Century of War. Please help me welcome David North.
For that introduction. Sorry.
Okay.
I would like to welcome those in this hall at the University of Michigan, and also those who are participating online within the United States and internationally to this meeting, which has been called to explain and discuss the political purpose, principles, and program that motivate the intervention of the Socialist Equality Party and its candidates, Joseph Kishore and Arisa Santa Cruz, in the 2020 presidential campaign. The principles, program, and purpose of this campaign are fundamentally different from that of every other party and candidate participating in this election. First, to begin with the most fundamental basis of this campaign. The Socialist Equality Party conceives of its campaign as international rather than simply national in scope. The main audience to whom our party and candidates will be speaking is the international working class and youth. We will not be presenting a program for national reform, spiced up with a few pinches of left-sounding rhetoric. Rather, we intend to use this campaign to explain to the American and international working class the program of World Socialist Revolution. Second, the program of our party is one that advances a scientific, that is Marxist understanding of the structure of capitalist society, the independent interests of the working class, and the inevitable escalation of class conflict within the United States and internationally. Third, the Socialist Equality Party will warn that the contradictions of the capitalist system lead inexorably toward ever greater levels of social inequality, exploitation, and poverty, and the suppression of democratic rights leading to the imposition of military police and fascistic dictatorships. Fourth, the Socialist Equality Party will insist that none of the problems that confront the great mass of working people in the contemporary world can be resolved without putting an end to the capitalist system and placing power in the hands of the working class. Nor can these problems be resolved on the basis of a national program within the framework of the existing national states. This is no less true for the United States and Canada than it is for the countries of Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Asia Pacific, and Central and Latin America. National problems are, in essence, world problems, requiring coordinated global solutions. The imperialist powers, led by the United States, are engaged in a frenzied military buildup in pursuit of their criminal geopolitical objectives. China and Russia are also building up their military forces. But as the national states prepare to fight over markets and pieces of territory, the coronavirus takes no notice of borders and spreads across the globe. The virus, traveling without a passport and without bothering to apply for a visa, is utterly indifferent to the nationality, ethnicity, racial background, and religion of its potential victims. And apart from and greater than the threat of a worldwide pandemic, humanity faces the rapidly developing danger of an ecological catastrophe produced by global warming. All these existential dangers arising out of the development of advanced industrial society cannot be solved on either a national or capitalist basis. The survival of human life depends upon a scientifically guided global solution, which cannot be developed and implemented as long as humanity is divided into competing nations and urgent social needs are subordinated to the capitalist profit system. It follows from all these previous points that the program of the Socialist Equality Party is based on an analysis of objective economic and social reality, and not on the present level of mass popular consciousness. Our candidates will not engage in empty demagogy, pretending that a global crisis of historic dimension can be solved on the basis of a bit of reformist tinkering. Comrades Kishore and Santa Cruz will tell the truth, the revolutionary truth, to the American and international working class. Strict adherence to this principle is of decisive importance in the present political situation and the fundamental obligation of a serious political party. It is obvious that this election will be different than any other in modern American history. Millions of working people are expressing and demonstrating interest in and support for socialism. The Socialist Equality Party recognizes and, of course, welcomes this development. In a country where anti-communism and anti-socialism have been for 3/4 of a century the foundation principles of American capitalist politics, the sudden upsurge of pro-socialist sentiment, which now finds expression in support for the candidacy of Senator Bernie Sanders, is clearly a major political development. But how is this to be explained? Exactly 10 years ago, the Socialist Equality Party, in the program that it adopted at its first biennial National Congress in 2010, wrote the following. There are many factors that underlay the failure of American workers to develop a politically independent mass socialist movement against capitalism. The sheer vastness of the American continent, the heterogeneity of a working class drawn to the United States from all over the world, the unscrupulous use of racism by the employers to divide and conquer, the notorious corruption and criminality of large sections of the trade union bureaucracy, and the ferocity of the anti-communist red-baiting campaigns of the government, big business, and the trade unions. Moreover, the crimes of the Stalinist bureaucracy in the Soviet Union gravely undermined the appeal of socialism in the eyes of American workers. In the final analysis, the vast wealth and power of American capitalism was the most significant objective cause of the subordination of the working class to the corporate-controlled two-party system. As long as the United States was an ascending economic power, perceived by its citizens as the land of unlimited opportunity, in which a sufficient share of the national wealth was available to finance rising living standards, American workers were not convinced of the necessity of socialist revolution. The change in objective conditions, however, will lead American workers to change their minds. The reality of capitalism will provide workers with many reasons to fight for a fundamental and revolutionary change in the economic organization of society. The younger generations of working people, those born in the 1980s, 1990s, and the first decade of the 21st century, do not know and never will know capitalist prosperity. They are the first generation of Americans in modern times who cannot reasonably expect to achieve a living standard equal to, let alone better than, their parents' generation. Young auto workers born in 1990 are paid less than half what their parents were once paid for doing the same work, and even more. As for the parents, many have lost their jobs and pensions. American working people are being drawn into the global maelstrom of a developing class struggle and are becoming aware that the emerging spirit of social resistance is taking place around the world, from Greece to Bangladesh. For decades, American workers were told that Asian workers were their enemies, the producers of low-cost products that deprive them of their jobs. But now they read and hear of strikes in China and begin to realize that the workers of Asia are not their foes, but their brothers and sisters. End of quote. This analysis, made a decade ago, is now being confirmed. The American working class, therefore, has changed its mind and is turning to socialism. But its understanding of what socialism is and what is really involved in its fight for that objective is of an elementary character. Bernie Sanders, with his vague pseudo-populist message, appeals to precisely this elementary level of political understanding. But it is at this very point that the Socialist Equality Party is politically obligated to raise the political level of the working class and youth. We support and encourage their aspirations, but we do not adapt to their illusions. Bernie Sanders talks about, though with less and less conviction, his so-called political revolution. But when it comes to explaining what precisely this consists of and how it will be achieved, he is rather short on specifics. He offers no explanation of how his proposals, which, to be frank, amount to little more than warmed-over old Democratic Party liberalism, will be achieved. He has not shown anyone the magic wand that he will wave to persuade the richest 1% to share their wealth with the 90% who are on the bottom of society, or how he will manage to combine a program of social reform with the continued expenditure of hundreds of billions of dollars on the military, which Sanders praised only yesterday on national television as, quote, the best in the world. Speaking of Norman Thomas, the leader of the American Socialist Party back in the 1930s, Leon Trotsky, the founder of our world movement, said, "The reformists have a good smell for what the audience wants. Thomas gives them that. But that is not serious revolutionary activity," unquote. Trotsky insisted that the program of a genuinely socialist party, quote, must be scientific, not bent to the mood of the masses. We are the most realistic people because we reckon with facts, which cannot be changed by the eloquence of Norman Thomas, quote. Today, we need only add that Bernie Sanders is far less eloquent than Norman Thomas was in the 1930s, and his program is not only far less radical, it is also far less realistic. The America of the 2020s is not the America of the 1930s. A President Sanders would not preside over a New Deal. His administration would be one of concessions and endlessly cowardly retreats before the ruthless demands of the corporations, the financial institutions, the intelligence agencies, and the military. He has already told us that he's prepared to go to war if that's what the intelligence agencies demand. We're not engaging in guesswork. Look at the record of Syriza in Greece, of Podemos of Spain, that of the Left Party in Germany. And remember what happened to Salvador Allende in Chile. That is not the socialism or so-called socialism that we will adapt to. In the last few months, the Socialist Equality Party and the World Socialist website have been intensely engaged in a struggle against the proponents of the so-called 1619 Project, which was initiated by the New York Times to promote a racialist historical narrative that denigrates the American Revolution and the Civil War and totally dismisses the struggles of the working class of all races, nationalities, and ethnicities. We have exposed the reactionary character of this racialist project, which denies the historically progressive character of the great democratic struggles of the 18th and 19th century that created the economic and political preconditions for the future socialist movement, the socialist movement of today. As Marxists in the United States, we understand that the defense of the progressive legacy of the first two American revolutions, that of 1775 to 83 and 1861 to 65, is necessary for the preparation of the third American Revolution. And there is still much which we can learn from those great historical struggles. As we are witnessing an immense change in the political orientation of the American working class, and wondering where it will lead and what it can accomplish. An explanation of the emergence of the first American Revolution, given in 1818 by one of its greatest leaders, John Adams, is particularly relevant. In a letter to a friend, Adams, then 82 years old and ruminating over the revolution which had occurred 40 years earlier, he wrote, "But what do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War? The revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people, a change in their religious sentiments of their duties and obligations. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections was the real American Revolution." Today, once again, a great change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of countless millions of people in the United States and internationally is taking place. They are preparing to change the social relations in which they have lived for so long. They are looking for new paths, new ways of organizing society and creating a better world. In this situation, the campaign of the Socialist Equality Party, which will be conducted in the closest collaboration with our comrades throughout the world in the International Committee of the Fourth International, will play a critical role in educating workers and youth, of infusing the growing mass movement with socialist consciousness, and providing a genuinely revolutionary political direction to the struggles that will develop in the course of this year and in the aftermath of the 2020 elections. And now I'd like to introduce the presidential candidate of the Socialist Equality Party, Joseph Kishore. And in an act of comradely solidarity, I have to give him my microphone. You are, Comrade Joe.
Okay. Difficulties, technical and not so technical. Wait, but I actually need that. Here, okay. Okay. Okay, thank you, Comrade David, and thank you, Sam. There is one issue that is really dominating this election. If you read the newspapers, tune in to the Democratic Party debates, watch CNN, listen to the speeches of Donald Trump, what is the one issue that everyone is talking about? Socialism. Now, this is, in fact, an extraordinary political fact, that socialism is the issue in the 2020 elections. As David said, this is, after all, the land of anti-communism. Anti-communism was the state religion. It's the supposed land of unlimited opportunity, the home of the American dream. And it turns out that millions and millions of workers and young people are opposed to capitalism and support socialism. And why is this the case? In fact, it's not that difficult to uncover the social reality that underlies this change in consciousness and thinking among American workers and young people. Consider some facts about American life. The 400 richest individuals in the United States now own more wealth than the bottom 64% of the population. 400 individuals, more than 209 million people. The richest 3 individuals own more wealth than the bottom half of the population. We live in an oligarchy, a handful of people who operate as social and economic ecosystems of their own. It was revealed just a couple weeks ago that Elon Musk, the owner of Tesla, increased his wealth by something on the order of $4 billion in one day. On average, in the course of the past year, he's increased his wealth over $300 million a day. Just one individual. We live in an oligarchy. At the same time, the conditions for masses and masses of working people and young people are horrible and getting worse. $1.5 trillion is now the level of student debt in the United States. We live in a country, as reported by the New York Times just this morning, where children as young as 6 years old are now being trained in the use of Narcan because the opioid epidemic, now killing 70,000 people a year, is so horrible. The result of social inequality, deindustrialization, the devastation of entire cities and communities. 2/3 of people now who file for bankruptcy do so because health care costs are so high. 42% of Americans have less than $10,000 in savings, less than $10,000 in savings, and therefore cannot retire. 14% of Americans have saved nothing for retirement at all. More and more older workers are continuing to work simply because they're unable to retire. That's the reality of social life in America. Over the past 40 years, the ruling class in this country has engaged in unending social counter-revolution, ripping up everything that workers were able to win in previous generations of bitter struggle. The so-called land of unlimited opportunity has become the land of low wages, of permanent indebtedness, of economic and social insecurity. The American dream has become the American nightmare. Now, these changes in objective conditions are leading American workers to change their mind. They're responsible for the growing interest in socialism, hostility to capitalism, and it's also expressed in the growth of the class struggle, social protests and opposition in the United States and really throughout the world. The past year, 2019, has seen mass demonstrations and protests and strikes in countries all over the world. The representatives of the ruling class are referring to the year of leaderless revolution, that we are entering a period of mass unrest all over the world, including in the United States. It's not covered much in the capitalist media, but the past 2 years, in fact, have seen a level of strike activity at its highest in over a quarter of a century. And that's despite the best efforts of the pro-capitalist nationalist trade unions to suppress every manifestation of social opposition. We've seen significant strikes of teachers over the past 2 years. Of course, a strike last year of General Motors auto workers, the first national strike of auto workers in decades. Now, most recently, the wildcat strike waged against the United Auto Workers by graduate students at the University of California, Berkeley, demanding cost of living adjustments and livable incomes. And this is really just the beginning. We are in a period of revolution. 30 years ago, at the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the representatives of the ruling class proclaimed that the fall of the USSR meant the end of history. And by that they meant that all the problems of the 20th century, that plagued the 20th century, were over. Fascism, dictatorship, world war, above all, class struggle and socialism, that belonged to the past. The future was going to be a future of capitalism, of peaceful social and economic and political development. The problems of the 20th century were not going to be the problems of the 21st. And it was not just, and above all, that socialism was over. And it was not just the ideologists of the ruling class that made those claims. Innumerable pseudo-left organizations and groups took the opportunity of the dissolution of the Soviet Union to declare that Marxism was over. The emphasis on the revolutionary role of the working class was over. It was going to be the era of intersectionality, of identity politics, opposition to the idea of the hegemony of the working class, the prioritization of the class struggle. All of that was over. Now, the International Committee of the Fourth International, we had a different analysis. We said that the fall of the Soviet Union did not mean the end of history, the end of class struggle, the end of socialism. On the contrary, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was itself an expression, an initial expression, of the crisis of the entire capitalist nation-state system. And we argued, and this is in the analysis is contained in a very important book by Comrade David North, the Russian Revolution in the Unfinished 20th Century. We said the 20th century was not over, it was unfinished. That is, that all the problems that plagued mankind in the 20th century would be the problems that workers would have to confront in the 21st. Now, that analysis has been proven absolutely correct. The end of the USSR did not inaugurate an era of peace, but of unending war. It did not mark the triumph of liberal democracy, but rather has produced the return of fascism, authoritarianism, and barbarism. And of course, it did not bring with it an end to the class struggle, but in fact, record social inequality and growing protests and revolutionary movements all over the world. And all the old filth of the 20th century is returning. It's not just in the United States. In Germany now, in Germany of all places, fascism is again a dominant political force. The AfD, which has been cultivated through a political conspiracy of the dominant bourgeois parties, is now the most significant political force in Germany. And the consequences of that, the consequences of the deliberate promotion of far-right fascistic politics in Germany, were expressed just this week in the horrific massacre that killed 9 individuals in Germany. Donald Trump now is visiting India amidst the return of communal violence, stoked and encouraged by the fascistic Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi. These are international phenomena. Now, within this context, what is the character of this election? And I want to address now more specifically the political situation here in the United States. Of course, there is the Trump administration, a government of the far right with distinctly fascistic characteristics. Trump represents all the filth of American capitalism. He's the product of decades of unending war, the adoption of torture as an instrument of state policy, the unending financial speculation, the criminalization of the ruling class. That all has now vomited up in political form the Trump administration. We know the character of this regime. But on the other hand, you have the Democratic Party. And what is the Democratic Party? Now, Sanders, who's acquired a lot of support, and I will address the question of Sanders more directly momentarily, but Sanders' basic claim is what? That somehow the Democratic Party can be turned into an instrument of social progress and reform. That's what his whole politics is based on. We can take over and transform the Democratic Party. But what is the Democratic Party? And I think it's important to recall certain experiences over the past 3 years in particular, and the way that the Democratic Party has responded to the Trump administration. Let us recall, in fact, that President Obama, in words that really should be written in his political obituary, declared upon the inauguration of Trump, and this was one of the truest statements that Obama ever made, he said that the election of Trump was a product of what he called an intramural scrimmage between two sides that were on the same team. Trump and the Democrats, whatever their differences, these were two sides on one team. And he stressed at the very beginning, he said, we have to do everything we can to make this administration successful. And now, of course, recall that the inauguration, the election of Trump, was immediately greeted by mass demonstrations of young people, of workers throughout the country. One of the largest coordinated demonstrations in the United States. That was the response of workers and young people to this administration who hated his anti-immigrant policies, his pro-corporate policies, his fascistic policies, were disgusted by the election of this figure to President of the United States. The Democrats' response was, we need to do everything we can to make this administration successful. They worked systematically to suppress and derail widespread popular hostility to the Trump administration. That was combined with the development of their own opposition to Trump. Everything was channeled, all the grievances that addressed the real social concerns of broad masses of people, that was suppressed in favor of what? The anti-Russia campaign. Everything, all criticism of Donald Trump resolved into he is a puppet of Vladimir Putin. It was all going to be directed behind the anti-Russia campaign. Of course, that culminated in the impeachment. Now, what was this all about? What was this conflict all about? Well, there were, of course, first of all, divisions and conflicts over questions of foreign policy. Dominant factions of the military intelligence agencies, the foreign policy establishment, were determined to ensure that there would be no retreat on the anti-Russia policy of the Obama administration. The heroes in this process, who were they? They became figures like John Bolton, the architect of the Iraq War, the impeachment trial and proceedings and demands of the Democratic Party in relationship to the impeachment resolved in the end to the demand that the American people should hear the voice of John Bolton, a war criminal in his own right. So there were divisions over foreign policy. But there were also a second and related consideration in the anti-Russia campaign was the desire to suppress and divert issues that motivated broad masses of people, the real social questions of concern to the working class. At the same time, it was utilized as a mechanism for criminalizing opposition. All social conflict in the United States was the product of Vladimir Putin. Putin was sowing divisions in the United States. Now, in this context, just a diversion, I think it would be remiss if in this meeting we did not make reference to and condemn the greatest political show trial of the modern era, which is happening now in Britain. Julian Assange, who's being dragged before an extradition hearing, orchestrated by the United States with the connivance of the United Kingdom and countries throughout the world, in a show trial. This is what it is. It is completely illegitimate. He has been denied the most basic requirements for carrying out a legal case to oppose extradition. He has, according to the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Torture, Nils Melzner, he has been subject to torture himself. This is a completely illegitimate proceeding that Assange is being subject to. It is, in fact, a political abomination. But let us recall that it is the Democratic Party that has spearheaded the campaign against Assange, utilized the anti-Russia campaign in order to pursue that persecution. There is, in fact, no opposition, including from Bernie Sanders, to what they are doing. And also Chelsea Manning, who remains in jail for taking the very courageous and principled stand of refusing to testify before a grand jury hearing against Assange. So that is the Democratic Party. Comrade David referred to the necessity for approaching politics in a scientific way. And I think that means that one has to approach politics in class terms, to understand political institutions and organizations in class terms, to reject a sort of pragmatism which fails to really understand the real nature of political organizations and class interests. This is the Democratic Party. It's the party of Wall Street, of the military and intelligence agencies. It is a right-wing, pro-capitalist party. Now, in fact, these very same methods which the Democratic Party has utilized in its conflict with the Trump administration are being employed against the Sanders campaign. Every dirty trick in the book is being brought out against Bernie Sanders. On the eve of the Nevada primary, you had this article in the Washington Post owned by one of the corporate oligarchs, Jeff Bezos, declaring completely unsourced that Vladimir Putin was intervening in the elections in order to support Bernie Sanders. Now you have, just a couple days ago, an article that could have been written by the CIA, and probably was, in the New York Times by Sanger, by David Sanger, appearing on the front page of the New York Times. Same goal, different playbook. Why Russia would support Trump and Sanders. And I just want to cite one passage, one quote from this, which I think gives the character and says a great deal about the framework of American politics. This is from Victoria Nuland, a leading top diplomat of the American state, who played a central role in the 2014 regime change operation in Ukraine. She was right there on the front lines promoting a right-wing movement that was in fact directed by fascists in the regime change operation in Ukraine. She says, in relationship to the claim that the Russians are intervening to support Sanders, she says, any figures that radicalize politics and do harm to center views and unity in the United States are good for Putin's Russia. Let's consider this. Any figures that radicalize politics, what are we doing? Or do harm to center views. Well, what are center views? Which he means the dominant views of the military intelligence agencies. Those are the center views. So any figures that radicalize politics and do harm to center views and unity in the United States. Well, wait a minute. The United States is not united. It's divided into two classes. One which controls the vast majority of the wealth, and the working class, which has nothing. Any figures that radicalize politics and do harm to center views and unity in the United States are good for Putin's Russia. Now, this is a recipe for outright political censorship. Any social and political opposition is the work of Vladimir Putin. It's the work of a foreign power. That's what they're saying. That's the narrative now that they're developing against the Sanders campaign. And it is really a filthy intelligence operation that they are carrying out. Now, what explains this campaign against Sanders? What is the motivations behind it? Well, I think there's several factors, but I think quite critical is the fact that the Democratic Party does not want to run a campaign which makes an appeal on questions of social inequality. They want to run a campaign based upon the denunciations of Trump as an agent of Vladimir Putin. And the ruling elite, more broadly, is terrified of the politicization of workers and young people. On class questions, what has really been revealed in the primaries so far in the support for Sanders? I mean, the Democrats have tried every play in the book. You know, the woman question. There was this stink bomb from Elizabeth Warren. Bernie Sanders said that a woman could never be president. This was supposed to be a method for taking down the Sanders campaign. It had the opposite effect. There's all the talk of Bernie bros and everything else. It has the opposite effect. Actually, the ruling elite has something of a catch-22. They are all so deeply hated that the more they attack the Sanders campaign, the broader his support. Sanders has now won the popular vote in the first three contests in the Democratic Party primary. And if one looks at the demographic, what's motivating people to vote for Sanders? Well, it's class questions. He's winning broadly among whites, among Latinos, among young, among old, all demographics. The The efforts of the Democratic Party to divide and the media to divide along race and gender, those are not really getting a response. David referred to the Project 1619. In the midst of this election, the New York Times initiates a project promoted heavily throughout the country in order to completely rewrite American history and contemporary politics in racial terms. This is a politics of the top 10%. It's not finding a broader resonance. People are really sick of this reactionary garbage, and they're motivated by questions of social inequality. Now, that brings us to the question of the role of Sanders himself and the character of this politics, which I think really has to be addressed. It is a fundamental political question that millions of young people and workers are grappling with. The Sanders campaign, of course, many young people are supporting it motivated by concern over questions of social inequality, opposition to war, motivated by class issues, but there has to be a real warning. Sanders and his principal political role is to direct this opposition behind the Democratic Party. Now, you might ask, well, Mr. Kishore or Comrade Kishore, okay, I agree with you on the character of the Democratic Party. It's really rotten character. I would even agree with you on, some of the criticisms you make of Bernie Sanders. But look, isn't this the best we've got? Won't this shift politics to the left, at least? At least it's something. He's creating a space. And I think this type of pragmatic politics really needs to be addressed. One of the lines that one often hears, and particularly from the Democratic Socialists of America, the recent conference of the YDSA, this was the line that they were giving to people who were very concerned about Sanders' statements in support of war. They would say, well, it's not Sanders, it's the movement. And yes, he may betray and he may carry out certain policies against the working class, but what's really important is the movement that we are building behind Sanders. But the question, of course, is where is that movement being directed? It's being directed back into the Democratic Party, this right-wing party of Wall Street and the military. And this, in fact, is not a recipe for the development and advance of a real, genuine socialist movement. It's a recipe for demoralization and defeat, and can, in fact, only play into the hands of the far right. I think, young people, workers, really, who are being politicized, really have to make a serious study of politics and a serious study of history. What are the historical experiences? Comrade David referred to some of them. There are, of course, many experiences within the United States of efforts to transform the Democratic Party. It is called, after all, the graveyard of social movements. All the efforts to progressive movements which have been channeled behind the Democratic Party and smothered. There's a long history of this. There are international experiences. There's the experience of Francois Mitterrand, the Socialist Party president of France, elected in 1981 on a program, in fact, more radical than that of Sanders, including nationalizations of major industries and banks and everything else. One should recall what happened there. The first day of his election, what happened? The markets tanked, the French franc, the financial markets collapsed, there was a capital flight out of France, and Mitterrand responded by immediately shifting on a dime. All the promises of social reform were abandoned, and it became then a period of austerity. There's the experience that Comrade David referred to, of Allende in Chile, who claimed that it would be possible to achieve socialism without the mobilization of the working class against capitalism and the state. And he disarmed the workers, and he opposed any mobilization of the working class. And what was the product of that? September 11th, 1973, the Chilean coup, which led to the deaths of thousands and thousands of workers and the death of Allende himself. There are more recent experiences of Syriza in Greece. The coalition of the radical left came to power in January 2015, promising major changes in austerity, social reforms. What happened there? Encountering in the aftermath of being elected, it immediately turned, in fact, to implement austerity, the demands of the banks. The Syriza government, headed by Alexis Tsipras, carried out the most severe austerity measures in the history of Greece. And in fact has become the front line of the vicious anti-refugee policy of the European Union. These are experiences that workers and young people have to really study in order to really understand the role of the politics of Sanders and similar tendencies internationally. Of course, there's also the experience of Corbyn in the UK, who was elected the leader of the Labour Party, proceeded, even while he was under attack, vicious slanders about anti-Semitism and everything else. He refused to carry out any fight against the right wing within the Labour Party, subordinated the working class to it, and what has come out of that? Boris Johnson, the Donald Trump of the United Kingdom. And then there are Sanders' own politics, which really have to be studied. I think the question of Sanders' foreign policy is absolutely critical to understand. What has Sanders' response been to the vicious attacks, Russia's aiding him in the elections and everything else? He has made a number of statements in which he is declaring to the military intelligence agencies, you can trust me on questions of foreign policy. David referred to the interview in 60 Minutes, which happened on Sunday, in which he declared, he said, he was asked the question by Anderson Cooper, if he thought there were any situations in which military action would be warranted. Absolutely, he said, of course I do. He said, they're hopefully as rare as possible, but yeah, we have the best military in the world. What does that mean? The best military in the world. The most violent, the most heavily funded with $1 trillion every year, the most involved in wars all over the world. He then went on to say, Sanders said he would consider military action if there were threats against the American people or threats against our allies. Well, could be anything. Threats against our allies. What does that involve? If Turkey is involved in a conflict with Russia, a NATO ally Turkey, does that mean that the Sanders government would launch a war against Russia? He then said, Cooper prompted Sanders with a theoretical Chinese invasion of Taiwan, to which Sanders responded, quote, I think we have got to make it clear to countries around the world that we will not sit by and allow invasions to take place. Absolutely. That is, that the United States, under Sanders' government, would wage a war against China over Taiwan. Well, let's talk about invasions. We start talking about Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Haiti, Somalia, Yugoslavia, many of the wars that Sanders himself supported. And I think this is critical for the young people who are attracted to Sanders, who are responding to his appeal on questions of social inequality, really work through. You cannot oppose the politics of the billionaire class at home if you support the policies of the billionaire class abroad. If you support American imperialism, you are not a socialist without opposing war. These are really critical questions, I think, that young people really have to work through and will go through experiences in the course of this election. Now, I would say that the politics of Sanders is based upon demagogy. I don't mean that just as an epithet, but as a political category. That is, a politics which is based on a vast chasm between the promises made, universal health care, abolish student debt, end college tuition, everyone's going to have a job, and social and political reality, and the reality of the program that Sanders himself is fighting for. What is the reality of American capitalism? This is a society dominated by a gigantic military intelligence apparatus, a massive police force, the instruments of repression. You have a ruling oligarchy that is absolutely opposed to any social reform, that will not tolerate any impingement upon its wealth. It has amassed unimaginable fortunes through the endless rise of the stock market that are premised on the assumption that everything will be ripped up. Healthcare, pensions, wages, everything is going to go. That is the American ruling class. What is required in such a situation is not a political revolution. And if one watches or reads Sanders' comments carefully, what he means by political revolution is that workers should support the Democratic Party. He actually, in this interview, 60 Minutes interview, he was asked by Cooper, what about your revolution? And he said, we don't want to talk about that so much anymore. He said, really, what's involved, we really don't want to talk about that, but what's involved is getting young people back into politics. People are disillusioned. They should support the political system again. That is, they should support the Democratic Party. What's required is not that so-called political revolution. What is required is a socialist revolution. And we have entered a decade of revolution. Trotsky, in his History of the Russian Revolution, his monumental account of the revolutionary developments in Russia in 1917, in the preface he wrote, quote, "The most indubitable feature of a revolution is the direct interference of the masses in historical events. In ordinary times, the state, be it monarchical or democratic, elevates itself above the nation, and history is made by specialists in that line of business, kings, ministers, bureaucrats, parliamentarians, journalists. But at those crucial moments, when the old order becomes no longer endurable to the masses, they break over the barriers excluding them from the political arena, sweep aside their traditional representatives, and create by their own interference the initial groundwork for a new regime." This is the period that we are in. This is the objective situation. We are in a period, in a revolutionary period. Mass demonstrations. This is a period of the forcible intervention of the masses into historical processes. What is required, however, above all, is the development within the working class of a consciousness of what it is fighting for and what it is fighting against, the forces against which it is arrayed, and what is required to win, to fight for its own interests. The instrument for the development of that understanding, the development of that consciousness, is the party, is the leadership. The Socialist Equality Party is intervening in these elections to fight to build a socialist and revolutionary leadership in the working class. We advance a genuine socialist program for workers. We insist that workers have basic social rights, the right to health care, to education, to a job, to a livable income, to housing and utilities, to a secure retirement, to a healthy and safe environment, to a world without war. We're fighting against the growth of fascism, authoritarianism all around the world, fighting to free Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning, to oppose internet censorship and the moves to dictatorship. But how can this program be realized? That is the question facing masses of workers and young people. The fight for the rights of the working class, the fight against capitalism, requires the building of a genuine international socialist movement in the working class. Comrade David outlined the basic elements of a genuine socialist program. Internationalism. There's not a single problem in the world today that can be solved within the framework of the nation state. If you consider such a massive question as climate change, it's impossible to address within the framework of one country. These are global questions. The problem of world war, of authoritarianism, of social inequality, these are global questions. We direct our appeal to the international working class, workers all over the world who share the same interests. Such a program must be based on the interests of the working class, opposing all forms of nationalism, of chauvinism, of racial and identity politics, all the efforts to divide workers against each other. And it must be revolutionary. The fight for socialism requires a frontal assault on the wealth and privileges of the ruling elite, an end to a society in which the giant banks and corporations are controlled by private individuals and run on the basis of profit. The creation of a society based on social need, democratic control of production, the establishment of a workers' government, a government of the workers, by the workers, and for the workers. Now, we are intervening in this election to build such a leadership that will connect the struggles of workers, the developing struggles of workers all over the world in a powerful movement for socialism. And I would urge you to join us in building this leadership. The International Committee of the Fourth International, the Socialist Equality Party, has a long political history. Our political program and tradition traces its origins to the fight of Leon Trotsky against the betrayal of the program of international socialism by Stalinism in the aftermath of the 1917 October Revolution. For over 80 years, the parties of the Fourth International have fought for the principles of revolutionary socialism against all those parties and organizations who sought to deceive and betray the working class. The Fourth International is the revolutionary party of the working class for a revolutionary era. Now, I think there are moments in history where a crossroads is reached, where two paths are clearly presented before mankind. I think we're at such a crossroads. One path leads to world war, to fascism, to barbarism. The other path leads to socialist revolution. Our task now is to make sure that humanity follows the correct path. Thank you.
All right, we are proceeding now to the question and answer session of the meeting. David North and Joe Kishore will be up here to take questions. I also want to announce that we actually have attendees listening in to this live stream from India, Serbia, Bulgaria, the UAE, Germany, England, Australia, New Zealand, across the US and many other parts of the world, so it's wonderful. And I think we'll just begin with a question that has come in from online. This question is coming from Lauren. Lauren asks, if Senator Sanders is a Democratic Party nominee, might the Socialist Equality Party then endorse him in a united front effort to defeat the fascist Trump?
No, under no circumstances. We would not enter into a political alliance of any sort with the Democratic Party, which is a capitalist party. This is an old question. It has come up in countless circumstances in the past. And it's based, you might say, it's of course the most pragmatic of all arguments. And it's not only based on a fundamental misunderstanding of socialist principles and socialist tactics, but also based on a fundamental misconception of the dynamic of politics. First of all, we don't look upon elections as things in themselves. Our party, as a Trotskyist, socialist, and a Marxist party, fights relentlessly and indefatigably for the political independence of the working class. The most fundamental task of a genuine socialist party is to overcome the influence of the capitalist class over the working class, to break the working class from capitalist ideology, capitalist politics, to identify for the workers what their historical, political, social interests as a class are. Now, in the United States, the critical question which has always confronted the Marxist movement is to establish the political independence of the working class And that has meant in the United States to break the working class from the influence of the Democratic Party. As I noted in my opening remarks, the question which has arisen in studying the history of the American workers' movement has always been, why hasn't the American working class broken with the Democratic Party? What are the reasons for this long entrapment of the working class within capitalist politics? And so our party has fought against this, and of course under circumstances where the enormous wealth of American capitalism, the relatively high standard of living, the immense ideological oppression of the working class, which is perhaps greater in this country than anywhere in the world, has made this problem so difficult. But it's something which we have continuously done. And now comes an election, and because of this election, we are to abandon this principled position and say, well, what we now have to do is forget everything we've always explained and always taught and adapt ourselves for the most pragmatic reasons to the Democratic Party. That is, to adopt the program of the lesser of two evils. I was reminded today by a comrade that Deb said that the lesser of two evils is always the worst evil. In other words, to abandon hard-fought positions in order for short-term and very illusory gains. Now, the greatest mistake is when you embark on such policies under the argument, well, don't we have to stop Trump? Isn't this the way to fight him? Is that it ignores what Trump really represents. Trump didn't come from nowhere. Trump is a product of the capitalist system. Trump is a product of capitalism in crisis. And to tell the workers that they can fight this and change this through some shabby electoral maneuver does nothing at all to deal with the problems which created Trump in the first place. Now, as you were told when I was introduced, I've been involved in revolutionary socialist politics now for a half century. And as long as I've been in the Trotskyist movement in the United States, every 4 years, I have heard arguments for supporting the Democratic Party on the grounds that in this election, this is what we must do because it's all we can, but that will prepare the path forward. That was what I heard in 1972 from McGovern, in 1976 for Jimmy Carter, in 1980 for Jimmy Carter, God forbid, we had to stop Reagan, 1984 for Mondale, 1988 for Dukakis, anyone remember him? 1992 for Bill Clinton, 1996 again for Bill Clinton, 2000 for Gore, I forgot him. My memory must be slipping. For Al Gore, who didn't even want to win the election, then in 2004 for Kerry, and then in 2008, in order to give hope a chance, Barack Obama. And 8 years of Barack Obama produced Donald Trump. Every single hope, every single expectation workers had for a improvement in their conditions if they brought to power, after all, an African American who might be more sympathetic to their problems, an argument which many white workers accepted. What did it lead to? The biggest bailout of the banks, the continuation of wars, the enrichment of a small elite. In other words, it produced the disillusionment and frustration which enabled Trump to exploit from the right the anger and disappointment of many workers. And then those who were supporting Obama turn around and say, well, this just proves that everybody's a racist. That's why, Trump won. No. He won because during the period of the Obama administration, the hopes and aspirations of the working class, black and white, Hispanic, were all frustrated and led in a blind alley. The critical question today is to fight to establish the political independence of the working class, to explain to workers under conditions in which they're moving to the left, in which they're taking a real interest in socialism, what that fight requires, not to become collaborators in driving them back to the Democratic Party. That would be the greatest betrayal. That would be worse, in fact, than Trump being reelected. Because Trump, if he is reelected, or whoever, or if Sanders is elected, will face the expectation and anger of a working class. And it's important and critical that our party educate the workers, raise their level of political consciousness, and build this movement and develop a leadership that will be able to provide a perspective and orientation for the working class within the United States and internationally. So no, under no circumstances will we abandon the most critical task of a revolutionary socialist movement. That is to fight for the political independence of the working class, to teach the workers to rely on their own strength, to advance their own program, to oppose in elections and when elections are passed, the representatives of the capitalist system. When you support, if we were to support Bernie Sanders, we would be taking political responsibility for the betrayals he would then carry out. So we're not going to change our line during an election because it seems to be politically convenient. These sorts of Philistine, short-term calculations have never led to anything good.
We have a question from the room now. We have a question from the room now.
Good evening. Your talks are very enlightening. Do you see any benefit at all from an eventual Sanders presidency for people who do believe in the principles of the Socialist Equality Party? Anything at all, or do you think it would be more detrimental if there were a Sanders presidency and it is unsuccessful? Thank you.
Well, I think it relates to the issues in the last question. I mean, first of all, what would be the character of a Sanders administration? Well, let me just, let me just perhaps go back to the issues raised in the last question. I think that as David was stressing, the basic political challenge and necessity for the working class is the development of its own independent political party, leadership, and program and perspective. I mean, and that means in the United States, the break with the Democratic Party, to understand what this party is. And throughout the whole history of the United States, the question of the political break with the Democratic Party has been an essential political question. Now, in relationship to Sanders, you know, Sanders is a Democratic Party politician. Actually, he was asked this question early in the election campaign at a CNN town hall. It was raised, well, aren't you an independent? Why are you running for the Democratic Party? He said, look, I'm actually a Democrat. I've been caucusing for the Democrats. My role is to encourage people to support the Democratic Party. He actually has repeatedly said he will back whatever Democratic Party presidential candidate is nominated. This is the Democratic Party. In terms of the actions, I mean, what would a Sanders administration do? Say Sanders is nominated and then elected, which is possible. The whole period up to his election and then after will be one of continual betrayal, adaptation to the demands of the corporate and financial elite. I mean, the stock market fell today. It was primarily a question of, I think, coronavirus, but also another factor was concerns over the implications of a Sanders campaign. I mean, the pressures will be enormous. It's not, I think we made this point in an article on the World Socialist website, it's not that Sanders is going to transform the Democratic Party will transform Sanders. That is, whatever social reform program will be quickly abandoned. I mean, one has to understand it from the logic of capitalist politics. So, I mean, if you ask, well, what benefit, I think one can approach it in that sort of those pragmatic terms. The basic political question for workers in the United States and internationally is the development of an independent political program for the working class, not the subordination, constant subordination of workers and young people to the parties of the ruling elite. The Democratic Party in office, regardless of who is the president, will be carrying out the policies and interests of the corporate and financial elite. It's the nature of the party, it's the nature of the state. That's the interest that will be advanced. And for workers to be trapped within this organization, the other point I would make, you know, the ability of Trump and the far right to exploit the situation for their own advantage is a product of this political subordination of workers and young people to the Democratic Party. That's the greatest, what happened actually, we should recall in 2016, the fact that Trump was elected. Of course, he lost the popular vote by 3 million, but he was able to get the Electoral College vote. Why? Because he was running against the second most hated presidential candidate in the history of the United States, Hillary Clinton, the candidate of Wall Street, of the military intelligence agencies. What was Sanders' role in that process? Similar to the current elections, although at perhaps an earlier stage, there was broad support for the Sanders campaign in the course of the Democratic Party primaries. Sanders' role after losing the primaries was to direct all of that behind Hillary Clinton. That created, in fact, the conditions for Trump to posture as the candidate against the status quo. So this type of politics, which seeks this sort of this pragmatic politics, which seeks always to find, you know, to avoid the principled questions, always leads to disaster. Our campaign is intervening. We're fighting in this election for a politics based upon a scientific analysis of the objective situation, the tasks of the working class, not only in the United States but internationally. And that means the fight to build a genuine socialist leadership in the working class. And that requires a political struggle, not just against the Sanderses, but the many similar political tendencies in the United States and all over the world who seek somehow to constantly to subordinate the working class to the political institutions of the capitalist state and in the United States to the Democratic Party.
I'd like to add just one further point, which is a political and theoretical issue. It was also part of the last question, because there was a reference to a united front. This is a term which has a certain history in the socialist movement. A united front is a agreement of working class organizations to combine their strength in the opposition to fascism. That question arose in Germany in the early 1930s when Trotsky called upon the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party, notwithstanding their fundamental programmatic differences, to agree to a common defensive struggle against the Nazis. The Stalinists and the Social Democrats rejected it. Now, when one speaks of combining class banners, that is, for a working class party to unite with a capitalist party, that's called a popular front. It means, in reality, the subordination of the working class to a capitalist program. Support for Sanders is support for private property. It's support for capitalist economics. One can't be more explicit. Sanders says that if he will support whatever Democrat is nominated, so it is entirely possible if he's nominated, or that if he is nominated, maybe Bloomberg will be the nominee. All his opponents declare quite explicitly that they oppose, they're fervent defenders of the capitalist system. Now, one other point which should be and so just to complete the thought, a support for Sanders would mean that one would abandon the struggle against the very economic system which is the cause of the crisis, capitalism. That is, one is advancing no solution. And when that type of politics has been applied, most notoriously in Spain in the 1930s, in France in the 1930s, those were the days of popular frontism, it led to the victory of fascism and World War II. In Chile, it led to the coup of Pinochet. In Greece, it led Syriza to carry out the most horrendous betrayals of the working class, which ultimately was one of the most extreme austerity, and which has now led to the election of a further right-wing government. So long historical experience has discredited such policies. There are not easy answers to difficult historical questions. You're not going to get socialism, as I said, by waving or looking for Sanders' magic wand. The fight for socialism is a fight to establish the political independence of the working class on the basis of an international revolutionary socialist program, to teach the workers to rely upon their strength, to oppose indefatigably, under all conditions, the representatives of the bourgeoisie. And one doesn't have to speculate very much as to what Sanders will do if he actually winds up with the nomination. After all, he's told us already that he's prepared to support wars and invasions. How can that lead? What does that mean? That means repression. That means suppression of the independent struggles of the working class. And one final point, because Sanders is the living embodiment of these sorts of popular front politics. He began as some sort of socialist. He built his entire political credibility on the claim that he was independent of the Democratic Party. But at the very point when the masses began to express hostility to the Democratic Party and began to look for an alternative, he abandoned his so-called independence and has led them back into the Democratic Party. And all the energy and all the anger, which could be directed toward the development of an independent movement of the working class, is being led back into the Democratic Party, where that opposition can be suppressed, disarmed, and the road can be paved for further political betrayals.
Great. We have another question coming in online. This is a question coming in online. A worker asks, what should we do to organize at work? Can the SCP's campaign help? We need to boot the union, but there's a lot of fear of retaliation. And another person asks, it's a similar question, as a longtime dreamer of socialism, how does the SCP fight for the working people? I wish I could have attended tonight.
I think those are both very important questions. This campaign is directed to the working class, to the independent political organization and mobilization of the working class throughout the world. In relationship to the campaign, we encourage workers throughout the country and internationally to organize contingents within your factories, supporters of this campaign, to yourself, campaign for it among your fellow workers, to popularize our program and perspective, and to really fight for this program in the working class. And we will be, in the course of this campaign, developing our orientation to workers. We will be campaigning outside of factories. The working class has to become politically mobilized. The vast majority of the population, which is really excluded from political life, that is our orientation. The question of the independent organization of the working class is critical. Our party, the Socialist Equality Party, fights for the formation of independent organizations of working class struggle, rank and file factory committees, to break the stranglehold, as this questioner pointed to, the stranglehold of the trade unions over the working class. The trade unions are not working class organizations. They have worked for decades to suppress the opposition of the working class to the growth of social inequality, to the unending attacks on wages, on benefits. Of course, the character of these organizations is perhaps expressed most crudely in the United Auto Workers, this criminal organization run by individuals who are being indicted or have been indicted for stealing workers' dues monies and accepting bribes from the company. During the contract of auto workers' contract last year and during the strike of General Motors auto workers, it took place at the same time as the leaders of the UAW were under indictment, and they were supposedly supposed to be representing the workers in their conflict with the auto companies. In fact, they were on the other side. It was a conspiracy of the auto companies, the UAW, to impose a further round of attack on auto workers. The strike was waged in defiance of the UAW. And the Socialist Equality Party, the World Socialist website Auto Worker Newsletter, campaigned for the formation of independent organizations of working class struggle. But this is true throughout the country and internationally. The pressing need for workers is the development of organizations of working class struggle, to unite their struggle. The unions don't unite the workers, they divide them. They divide them, American workers from Mexican workers, from Chinese workers. They divide one sector of the working class from the other, one factory from the other. Our campaign, the Socialist Equality Party, has waged a determined struggle, which is meeting growing support among workers for the formation of independent organizations of working class struggle. And that is really a prerequisite for the development of a unified struggle of the working class, a real development of a social movement in the working class. We have seen, as I noted, the growth of class struggle over the past 2 years. But this has been waged in defiance. If you look at the teachers' strike, a similar character, waged in defiance or outside of the control of the unions. The role of the teachers' unions has been to isolate the struggles of teachers, to suppress them, to impose defeats. So what the working class really requires is to form independent organizations, and that has to be, though, combined with the development of a revolutionary program and perspective in the working class. So for all workers here and who are listening to this, I really urge you to support this campaign, become involved in it, take up the struggle of the Socialist Equality Party which is spearheading the fight for independent organizations, and take up the fight to build a socialist political leadership in the working class. There's not a single social right of workers that can be won without the development of a political movement in this country and internationally against the capitalist system.
We have another question coming from the room.
Hey, good evening. Thank you for giving us this very in-depth analysis of the multitudes of deception and manipulation behind the, American liberal democracy. But I feel like since we've been talking about politics for a while, I want to encourage us to shift our gears towards something that's more, bread and butter. Since we're here at the campus of the University of Michigan, my questions mostly have to do, with students with this community of the University of Michigan, which is a community that is predominantly made up by people from, well-to-do families, even petite bourgeoisie. And I meant, we as college students, we tend to say we care about a lot of stuff, but in reality, we don't. Not all of us go to, Whole Food, not all of us use fair trade stuffs. I personally use an iPhone that is made out of minerals excavated with child labor somewhere in the world. In general, the phenomenon of class traders is often the rare of the rare. Now, college students tend to be more radical, so let's say it's not rare of the rare, but still it's going to be rare. And I'm just wondering, first of all, like, what do you guys expect from us? And how do you persuade us, the college students, to join ranks with into the movement that is aimed at the expropriation of, bourgeois properties? And my second question, so that was my first question. And my second question is, about the things that, we say we care. Let's assume that we do care about some of the things that we care. We say we care. For example, college loans, the housing price, job security, freedom, these kind of stuffs. What is the Socialist Equality Party's program to address concerns along these lines? Thank you.
We have time for just at least one or two more questions, it seems like.
Hello. Well, I think that the question raises a number of issues, and I'll address a couple of them. First of all, I think that students is to refer to students as primarily petty bourgeois, I think is not accurate. I mean, students, the category of students is a heterogeneous category, but many students now are working class, including here at the University of Michigan. I mean, I think that the experiences of a whole generation of young workers, including many workers and young people who are going to college, is one of, as it was referred to in the lecture, one of economic insecurity, indebtedness. I mean, what is the tuition at the University of Michigan now? It's, tens and tens of thousands of dollars every year. People graduate with a mountain of debt. Of course, there are also layers of the middle class. I would not use the word class traders. There will be layers of the middle class who turn to revolutionary politics and who are won to a perspective of a fight to orient to the working class and build a movement in the working class. There are, there is a radicalization of students. I think, though, that, I think that in terms of what is required, I think one critical issue to understand the role of the universities in the cultivation and promotion of bourgeois politics. The campuses are themselves a battleground. I mean, you take a campus like the University of Michigan. I mean, this is a center of the promotion of racial identity politics, of Democratic Party politics. It's promoted very, very aggressively. Of course, not just here at the University of Michigan, but other campuses throughout the country. This is associated with the promotion of reactionary, idealist, philosophical conceptions of postmodernism. I referred in my report to the conceptions that were developed by the so-called left, the end of Marxism. This was to be the era of identity politics, of intersectionality. Of course, these are conceptions which are promoted in the universities. It was a professor at Wayne State University by the name of Arisen who wrote an infamous book called After Marxism, that the end of the Soviet Union meant the end of Marxism, the end of the class struggle. These are conceptions which are very actively promoted on the universities. And I think that what's really required is a fight against that. We're waging such a struggle, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, and I would urge all young people to join the IYSSE, our youth and student movement. We are waging a struggle on the campuses against the ideological and political conceptions which are promoted. And one form this has taken is the fight against the 1619 Project. They're holding meetings all over the country on this project, the effort to promote racial divisions and conflicts, to rewrite all of American history. Young people and students really have to take up a fight against this. They have to take up against a fight against the conceptions which predominate, and a fight for genuine Marxism. That means a theoretical and political struggle, and it also means, and is bound up with, an orientation to the working class, to the development of a political movement of the working class. Young people, students, whatever their social background, who are won to the perspective of a revolutionary socialist movement, they must then orient to the working class. You raised with the question of how any of the social issues confronting young people and students can be addressed. Well, that's through the mobilization of the working class. I referred to the strike of graduate students at the University of California. And you talk about, I mean, they face a situation where their monthly wage does not even cover the average rent in Santa Cruz. They've waged a strike because even just covering the rent, not even everything else, is not covered by the wage that they're receiving as graduate students at the University of California, and they're waging a strike. Well, how can such a struggle be won? It has to be based upon a turn to the working class, a mobilization of the working class. So I think the theoretical and political struggle on the campuses against the ideological and political conceptions which are promoted, the politics really of the Democratic Party, the politics of the New York Times, that has to be connected to a real fight to orient to the working class and mobilize and politically organize the working class on the basis of a socialist program.
Okay, this is, I think, an important question, and it's somewhat of I think, related to what was just discussed. This question comes from Noah. Noah asks, many socialists adopted intersectionality to reconcile historical inequities in the working class. Can you respond to class reductionist critiques of the Socialist Equality Party?
Well, these are, in a way, illustrates the very point, or confirms the very point that Joe made in his reply to the last question. The universities are breeding grounds of various forms of bourgeois ideology, anti-Marxism. The term class reductionism, which one hears so frequently today, is an attempt, if one were to look at it historically, to throw back social science to where it was before Marx and Engels emerged on the scene. Before there was the materialist conception of history and the scientific analysis of capitalist society presented by Marx in Das Kapital. The great achievement of Marx, building upon, as he explained, English political economy, French socialist theory, and the greatest achievements of German classical philosophy, was to finally uncover the real motivating processes of history. How was one to explain great events? How was one to explain the development of society? What were there laws that existed which could be understood? Prior to Marx, in one or another form, the motivating forces in history were of an ideal character. That is, change was explained from the ideas in people's heads. But the actual study of where those ideas came from, the material interests which underlay them, the social structures of society upon which they were based, that was not understood. And the great achievement of Marx and Engels in the elaboration of the materialist conception of history was to explain that the real basis of society was to be understood not in the ideas of an age, but in its economics. And in the actual social structure of society, how did human beings produce the means of their subsistence? What was the economic structure of society? And it was Marx and Engels who established that if one wanted to have a scientific understanding of the motivating forces, one had to understand the significance of classes. That the history of all major societies had been the history of class struggle. In the ancient world, between slave and slave owner, in the feudal world, between the nobility and the serfs, and in the emerging modern capitalist society, between the working class and the proletariat. And not only did they assert that but they substantiated that both through a study of history and through an examination of the actual mechanism of capitalist production and the fundamental mechanism by which capitalism produces wealth and profit, that is, through the exploitation of the working class. And the scientific character of Marx's achievement was shown in that it was substantiated. Marx anticipated that the development of capitalism would lead to ever greater social conflict between the working class, which was a new social force, and the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class. And that was to be substantiated in all of subsequent history. Now, the attempt to abandon that analysis, to oppose it, by counterposing various other forms of conflict, the conflict of genders, the conflict of races, the conflict of nationalities. These are not only unscientific, they are profoundly reactionary. Why we have concentrated on the question of 1619? Because it posits a history of the United States which says that the history of America is the history of racial war, not of class struggle, but of racial war. And what is the program to which this leads? Racial conflict, wars between the races, putting aside the fact that the very category of race is itself totally unscientific. There is no such thing in biology as race. This is a reactionary category, and it is a category, by the way, which is at the heart of every single fascistic ideology operating in the world today. We see its recrudescence in Germany, we see it throughout Europe, we see the use of anti-immigrant hatred supplementing the old hatreds of anti-Semitism directed against different communities, not just those who have come from outside or have been forced into immigration by the wars of imperialism, but against even populations and people who have lived for many, many decades in Germany or in Italy and other European countries. Racism is you cannot explain in any rational scientific way the development of humanity and of human history through the use of such a category. And so the very point that Joe made and why we do pay a great deal of attention to the universities is because it is often here that the major ideological struggles have to be fought out. Because the bourgeoisie seeks through the academics and through the universities very often to disorient the working class. By the way, I must ask, are there any academics here, any professors from the University of Michigan? Not one. Hardly surprising. Because the academy has become a center for the promotion of bourgeois ideology, often in its most reactionary forms. Marxism is not popular among the academics, who actually are the ideological spokesman of a very privileged section of society. One point, I think, which we must make before we conclude tonight is that we've explained that if you want to understand American politics, and indeed the politics of most of the advanced countries in particular, the politics which is based on various forms of identity, that is identity politics, it really is a struggle within the top 10% about the redistribution of wealth at the top. It doesn't express any interest whatsoever in the interests of the broader sections of the working class. It's not a matter of redistributing wealth through the reorganization of the collective wealth of society. It's not a matter for them of ending the exploitation of the working class. They know there's a great deal of money sloshing around at the very top, and those who are part of the top 10% want it, and so you have various identities trying on the basis of ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, race, to claim a portion. And finally, in relationship again to 1619 and the attention given to racial politics, of course, American slavery was a monstrous crime. It was a monstrous form of oppression. And yet it must be understood, and the origins of slavery do not lie in racism. Racism emerged as a justification for slavery. If you want to talk about slavery, you're talking about the history of the development of capitalism, not just in the United States, but on a world scale. And it was, of course, Marx and Engels who said so eloquently, as they supported the struggle of the North against the South, that labor in the white skin cannot be free as long as labor in the black skin is enslaved. And so our challenge is to unify the working class, all sections of the working class within this country, and of course internationally. To conclude, our slogan is not races of the world divide, it's workers of the world unite. Anyway, I want to thank you for your attention. Very glad that this is an important kickoff meeting for Comrade Joe, and I hope there'll be many more as we develop this campaign in the course of the year. Thank you very much.